Hi, my name is Salome. My parents said it was a healing ritual, but they shaved my head in a courtroom, in front of strangers, with cameras running. They said it was love. They said it was care. But then, 3 minutes later, they realized I wasn't there to be fixed. I was there to take the judge's seat. The same woman they erased was now presiding over their fate. But what kind of family calls that justice? What kind of mother signs away your rights, then smiles while the clippers buzz? And how do you hold your ground when the people who raised you are trying to bury you alive, one signature at a time? Would you want to hear the rest? It was hot that morning, hotter than it had any right to be for late October in Savannah. The kind of heat that clings to your skin like guilt. Ceiling fans spun lazily in the parlor of my late grandfather's estate, doing more to spread the scent of lemon polish and old wood than offer relief. We were all gathered, my mother Verena, my siblings Isolde and Cassian, a handful of cousins and their bored spouses, and me. Seated in the far back, like someone waiting to be excused. I hadn't expected much, but I also hadn't expected nothing. The lawyer, a wiry man with tight lips and a looser collar, cleared his throat and began reading the will. Cassian stood to one side, nodding with the self-assured grace of a man who'd already read it in advance. Isolde, flawless as ever, sipped a mimosa from a crystal flute, barely pretending to listen. Cassian Arkell, the lawyer said, is named primary beneficiary of the family estate and land holdings, including the Bryan Oak Farm and secondary assets related to Arkell Timber. No surprise there. My brother had always been the legacy builder, according to family lore. Despite his borderline shady business deals and whispered lawsuits, my mother had dubbed him the backbone of the Arkell name. That name she loved more than she'd ever loved truth. Isolde Arkell, he continued, is granted control over Arkell Communications, including all PR branches and legacy media investments. Of course, the Golden Girl. She'd curated her life like a Pinterest board, public, polished, carefully filtered, perfect daughter, perfect teeth, perfect betrayal. My name didn't follow. It never came. I waited. Quietly. I smiled when I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale. My palms were damp, even though the air inside was cooler than outside. When the lawyer reached the end, closing his folder with a finality that sounded more like a door slamming, I cleared my throat. Was there a second envelope? My voice didn't crack, not because I wasn't cracked, but because I'd learned to patch the brakes in real time. He looked at me, eyebrows lifting slightly. No, ma'am. This was the only will filed with the county. My mother didn't meet my eyes. She adjusted the diamond brooch on her blazer and nodded once, as though someone had asked her if the weather was tolerable. Not even a trinket, not even a God-blessed candlestick. I stood, straightening my spine like it was the last thing I had control over. Thank you, I said to the room, to no one, and walked out. I didn't cry in the garden. I don't cry where they can see. Instead, I walked the stone path to the magnolia trees. These weren't just any trees. They were the ones my grandfather and I had planted together when I was 7, our hands dirty, our laughter loud. I remembered him kneeling beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder and whispering, "One day, this land will know your touch even after I'm gone." He was gone now, and the land? It had been signed away to Cassian with the stroke of a pen and the silence of a mother. Funny thing about being erased, it doesn't start with violence, it starts with a lack of mention. I sat on the edge of the old stone bench beneath the biggest tree, its branches hanging heavy with late blooms. My fingers traced the carved initials we'd etched into the bark decades ago. GP, for Grandpa Philip. SE, for me. The S had faded. The sky was dimming as I walked back toward the circular driveway. Guests were milling about, offering condolences and air kisses, none of them for me. I passed Cassian near the entry hall. He raised his glass slightly. Tough morning, huh? I stared at him for a second. Depends on who you ask. He grinned, smug and untouched. Hey, FYI, company papers just got refiled. Hope you're cool with the name thing. I blinked. What name thing? He tapped his phone and walked away, already laughing at something Isolde had whispered behind her hand. Back in my car, I opened the text message that had just buzzed in. It was from Cassian. FYI, company papers just got refiled. Hope you're cool with the name thing. I stared at the screen, pulse steady now, but only because the drop had already happened. What name thing? It didn't matter. I knew it couldn't be good. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I just laid there in bed, staring at the ceiling fan moving in slow, hypnotic circles like it had nothing better to do. The text from Cassian kept replaying in my mind, each word sharpening like a knife. Hope you're cool with the name thing. The arrogance, the entitlement, the complete disregard. By mid-morning, I'd showered, dressed, and driven downtown to the clerk's office under the pretense of pulling documents for a civil case I was overseeing. I told myself that's all it was. But deep down, I was already hunting for the next betrayal. I didn't have to wait long. The woman at the desk, a cheerful woman with tired eyes, slid a packet across the counter. I thanked her and found a spot in the corner near a dusty fake plant and a buzzing fluorescent light. Flipping through the paperwork, I saw it, my name. Salome Everin, Executive Officer, Arkel Equity Holdings. For a second, I stared like it wasn't real. Maybe it was a typo. Maybe it was another Salome, but no, my social security number, my old work email, a digital signature I had never given. I felt it then, not just shock, but something more subtle, like my name had been put on someone else's trophy without my permission. I flipped through more pages. There were bank account authorizations, approval for corporate loans, a signed resolution in my name. All forged. It wasn't even done well. The signature looked like someone tried copying it from a birthday card. I walked out, clutching the file to my chest like it was the last real thing I had left. The late morning sun hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk, but I didn't feel it. I didn't feel anything until I reached the parking garage and leaned against the car door. Then I felt everything at once. Driving to Cassian's office didn't feel like a decision. I was just moving. By the time I stepped into the sleek lobby of Arkel Equity's downtown headquarters, I was operating on something colder than rage. I told the receptionist my name. She froze. Cassian's office was made of glass, sunlight hitting polished surfaces and casting long shadows. He stood when he saw me, all smiles like we were about to discuss the weather. "Sal," he said, casual, stepping from behind his desk. "You got the papers, huh?" "I did." "Good. Look, it's just a temporary thing. Placeholder stuff, bank stuff, you know how it is. We needed to push things through fast, and your name, well, it helps grease wheels." "You used my name without my consent," I said, slow and clear. He leaned on the edge of his desk, arms crossed. "Come on. You didn't want anything from the will. We figured this was kind of like giving you a role, a way in." "Without telling me?" I asked. Before he could answer, I heard the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain. Verena entered, holding a teacup like it was a prop in some southern drama she thought she was starring in. "Sometimes," she said, "it's easier to let those who can't handle pressure just carry the name, not the weight." Isolde followed her in, eyes glued to her phone like this entire scene bored her. "You said you didn't want a piece of the family business," she muttered without looking up. "Now you're upset because you're in it?" It hit me in the chest, not the words, but the way they'd already rehearsed them. "You used me," I said. "No," Cassian said. "We included you. You forged my signature. We handled what needed handling." Verena sipped her tea. "Sweetheart, this isn't personal. It's logistics." There was a moment, just one, where I almost said something loud, something that would have made heads turn in that office, but instead I straightened my blouse, tucked the papers back into the envelope, and said, "I'll be in touch." Back in my car, I sat motionless for a long while. The air conditioning hummed, but I didn't feel cooler. I dialed Mavis, an old classmate from law school who now worked in ethics compliance. "This is bad," she said, after I explained. "That's identity misuse, at best. Corporate fraud, possibly worse." "If I push this forward," I said, "I'm blowing up my own family in court." "You're not blowing them up," she said. "They lit the match." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I thanked her and hung up. That night, I poured a glass of wine, sat at my dining table with the file, and stared at it like it could explain itself. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I just stared, remembering a dinner 3 years ago. We were at the estate for a holiday gathering. The wine was flowing, the table full. Cassian had stood up, lifted his glass, and said, "To the smartest, sharpest, most trustworthy woman I know, my baby sister, couldn't have gotten through that IRS mess without her." I'd laughed. I'd blushed. I'd believed for a moment that I belonged. Now that memory made my stomach churn. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. I was just about to shut the lights when I noticed something shoved under my front door. An envelope. No name, no address. Just one typed line inside. "If they used your name once, what else did they sign without you?" I stared at it, the weight of every silence and every polite smile pressing down on me. I hadn't even begun to count the ways they'd rewritten my life without me. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter all night like a silent dare. One typed sentence, no sender, no return address. I stared at it over coffee the next morning while the pot gurgled behind me, filling the kitchen with the smell of routine I could no longer trust. If they used your name once, what else did they sign without you? By noon, I'd made up my mind. I didn't call ahead. If I did, they'd prepare. So I showed up at my mother's home just after lunch, unannounced. Verena liked to call it the library, but it was really just a glorified sunroom where she displayed books she'd never opened and portraits of herself from younger, more polished years. She was already seated when I arrived, tea set laid out like we were preparing to discuss literature, not legal warfare. Cassian and Isolde flanked her on either side, like a board of directors ready to cast a vote. "Salome," Verena said, her smile just tight enough to be polite. "So good of you to join us. We were just finishing up a few things." On the coffee table in front of them sat a slim manila folder, unopened but clearly staged. A silver pen rested neatly beside it. The air smelled like lemon polish and manipulation. "I wasn't aware we had a meeting," I said, removing my sunglasses. "Oh, this isn't formal," Cassian chimed in. "Just some paperwork, a little housekeeping." Isolde barely looked up from her phone. "It's a formality, really, just to smooth everything over for the trust." Verena gestured delicately toward the folder. "It's just a confirmation, sweetheart. You're still part of us." Still part of us, like someone had to remind them. I sat, slowly. I didn't touch the folder. I opened it with my eyes first. Language mattered. They taught me that in law school, especially when it was vague, passive, and designed to sound harmless. Voluntary release of beneficiary interest. Waiver of involvement in asset decisions. A dozen ways to say, "Sign this and disappear." I looked up at Cassian. "Who drafted this?" "Legal team," he shrugged. "It's boilerplate stuff. You're not even involved in the business, Sal. It's just technical. You forged my signature on corporate documents. That was a misunderstanding. And now you're asking me to officially sign away my rights? It's protection," Verena interjected smoothly. "For you, for us, no drama, just clean lines." I set the pen aside and folded my hands. My voice didn't rise. "I don't sign what I didn't write." The air shifted. Verena's smile thinned. "You always were the dramatic one." "I'm not being dramatic," I said. "I'm being clear." Cassian leaned forward. "Look, you said no to the will. That was your choice. Now you want to be involved?" "I never said I wanted to be erased," Isolde snorted. "Jesus, Salome, you act like this is some kind of conspiracy." Verena's voice dropped, her tone sugar-coated but sharp. "Then don't be surprised when you're treated like a guest in this family." I stood, collecting the folder, not to sign, but to take. "I'll be in touch," I said, echoing my words from Cassian's office. This time, I meant it. Outside, the sun was too bright. I drove without music, my pulse a metronome of controlled fury. I parked near the notary office listed on the previous forged documents and walked in with purpose. The receptionist, a young man with a nervous haircut, looked up and blanched slightly. He retrieved the logs when I asked and called for Mr. Banning, the notary in question. We sat across from each other in a cramped office. I showed him the signature, the authorization, the filings. He stammered. I was told you'd already given digital consent. It came through as a pre-authorized form. I didn't. Look, I'm sorry. I was told it was fine. You processed fraud, I said, not accusing, just stating. That's a felony. His face drained of color. I didn't know. I swear. They said you were in on it. They were wrong. I asked for copies of all associated documents and had him write a statement acknowledging his error. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I left with a folder full of leverage. Later that evening, I walked into my apartment just as the sky turned a soft gold outside. I kicked off my heels, poured a glass of water, and placed the folder next to the one from that morning. That's when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. The voice was distorted, masked, but the message was clear. You think you can fight the people who raised you? You're not the judge in this house. I deleted it. Then I downloaded a copy. They were wrong. I've spent my life learning how to fight, by knowing when not to swing first. The voicemail played in my head long after I deleted it. That voice, distorted, smug, felt like a match being struck in the dark. I knew it hadn't come from some anonymous outsider. No, that kind of threat wore designer shoes and signed holiday cards. It came from people who knew exactly how to make destruction look like concern. 3.5 weeks later, I got the official envelope from the court. Heavy paper. Raised seal. A quiet bomb. Petition for mental health evaluation. Filed under concerns about emotional capacity, citing historical episodes of instability and impaired judgment. The attached affidavit referenced therapy records from college, records I never thought anyone else even knew existed. And at the bottom, in bold, petitioners, Verena Arkell and Cassian Arkell. They were trying to strip me of legal autonomy, using my own pain as the justification. I sat at my desk for a long time, just staring at the letter. The sun had moved across the floor by the time I exhaled. I opened the bottom drawer, reached for the small wooden box I hadn't touched in years, and pulled out the old business card of the therapist I'd seen back in college, Dr. Marie Kenley. That was 21 years ago. The memories came slow and sharp, like old glass. Sophomore year. A night walk across campus that turned wrong. A stranger's hand on my wrist, the echo of gravel under my shoes. I hadn't reported it. I barely told anyone. I spiraled into silence, anxiety, and short tempers with friends who didn't understand. I finally walked into the campus health center and asked for help. Dr. Kenley saw me for 8 months. She never judged. She just listened. Diagnosed PTSD, mild. Prescribed a journal, not a prescription. I got better. I'd never told my family. Not one word. So how the hell did they get those records? By the next morning, I had scheduled a visit with the hospital's legal archive department. The facility had moved since the early 2000s, now tucked into a sterile building across from a strip mall on the edge of town. I walked in with my bar license in one hand and a signed request form in the other. The clerk behind the window looked up with mild surprise. You're requesting release of your own mental health file? Yes, and I want a full audit log. Who accessed it, when, and for what purpose? She frowned. That may take a day or two. I can wait. I pulled out a notepad and pen and sat in the waiting area while they worked behind the scenes. It took 2 hours. When they called me back to a side room, the clerk handed over a manila envelope and a second folder with printouts. I scanned them quickly, flipping past my own intake notes until I saw what I was looking for. Requesting party, Amanda G. Welton, Cassian's executive assistant. She had requested the file using a signed release form, supposedly from me. I studied the signature, a sloppy forgery. My name, written like a stranger trying to mimic my loops and spacing. I looked up at the clerk. This is fraud, she swallowed. We were told it was urgent legal documentation. And no one verified the signature? She said nothing. I closed the folders and stood. I'll need notarized copies of everything. I left the building calm, but my pulse had its own rhythm. The following weekend, Isolde threw one of her charity galas. Something glossy and televised, held at a ballroom in the downtown hotel with champagne fountains and step and repeat banners featuring corporate sponsors who didn't know, or didn't care, how much blood money paid for their branding. I wasn't invited. I showed up anyway. I wore black, not out of symbolism, but because it made me invisible in crowds like that. I slipped past the check-in table, nodded to the event staff, and found her near the cocktail bar, surrounded by PR interns and local influencers snapping selfies. She turned when she saw me. "Salome," she said, voice dipped in saccharin. "This isn't your scene." "I'm not staying," I said, and handed her a sealed envelope. "But you might want to remind your brother that HIPAA still applies." She blinked. Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked down at the envelope like it had started ticking. "I don't know what you think this is," she started. "It's evidence," I said, "that your family committed a federal crime." Isolde stepped closer. "Why can't you just let this go?" I met her gaze. "Because you didn't just erase me. You tried to rewrite me." I turned and walked out, leaving her speechless for once in her over-rehearsed life. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with every folder spread out in front of me. Court papers, forgeries, medical records, audit trails. Then I saw something I hadn't noticed before. In the bottom corner of one scan, blurred but visible, was a redacted note. "Release approved under parental authority. Guardian consent, Verena Arkell." I stared at it. The date. February 2002. I was 19 years old. An adult. They wanted control so badly they forged care into custody. If they wanted war and whispers, I was done playing quiet. The next week passed in slow drips. Emails, muted calls, the sound of heels echoing off courthouse floors. I'd become numb to the rhythm of being professionally undermined. But when the envelope came, sealed in gold-trimmed legalese and couriered straight to my chambers, I didn't flinch. Inside was a formal notice: Arkell Family Holdings versus Salome Everin, filed under intentional obstruction of fiduciary function, libel, and reputational damage. The kind of lawsuit designed to look sophisticated while smelling like desperation. At the bottom, Cassian's name, bold and proud. Isolde's signature sat beneath his, soft and looping like a signature on a birthday card, not a legal weapon. Verena, of course, was non-participatory, publicly detached, privately orchestrating every move. I imagined her sipping tea as the documents were printed, nodding once with that same expression she wore when she cut people off mid-sentence, like silence was her final word. Reading the complaint felt like watching someone draw a portrait of me using charcoal and spite. They called me volatile, emotionally erratic, claimed I had publicly slandered the family brand, and threatened familial interests by interfering with legally binding operations. They even cited my success in previous litigation, twisting it into a pattern of legal aggression driven by personal vendettas. The irony wasn't lost on me. They weren't just suing me, they were trying to rewrite me, again. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, letting the overhead light wash over my closed eyelids. I didn't feel anger, not yet. I felt something colder, more precise. I needed Mavis. I called her that evening, and we met the next morning at a quiet cafe near her townhouse. She arrived in slacks and a blazer 2 sizes too big, like she'd finally stopped pretending she had to impress anyone. She slid the papers across the table, didn't speak for a while. Then she looked up. "They're not treating you like a sister, Sal. They're treating you like a threat." I exhaled. "They're trying to make me a case, not a person." She nodded. "Good. You see it clearly. Now let's act accordingly." We spent the next hour reviewing every line of the complaint. I handed her the notarized document from the notary, the forged authorization from Chapter 2. Then I slid across the HIPAA violation confirmation from the hospital archives. "This isn't just a countersuit," she said. "It's a fuse." "I want them to know," I said quietly, "that I'm done asking to be left alone." That afternoon, we filed a defamation response with an attached motion for discovery. We didn't hold a press conference. We didn't call the local papers. We filed it the way they'd taught me to file anything powerful, clean, quiet, and legally devastating. That night, I made dinner, boiled pasta, poured wine. My apartment was dim and calm, with soft jazz humming in the background. I was halfway through the first bite when the doorbell rang. I knew before I opened it. Verena stood there in a silk blouse and a scent I hadn't smelled since childhood, a floral perfume she wore when she needed to disarm someone. She didn't ask to come in. She just did. "Don't worry," she said, setting her purse down like she owned the room. "I'm not here to fight. Just to talk." I stayed standing. "You're overplaying your hand," she said after a long pause. "You think showing them a few papers makes you powerful?" I tilted my head. "You came to my house to say that?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You don't win this by making noise. You win by knowing when to disappear." I didn't answer right away. I let the words hang in the air, just long enough to wilt. Then I met her gaze, steady, unapologetic. "Then maybe it's time I stopped disappearing." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She turned, collected her purse, and walked out, her heels echoing against my floor like punctuation. The door clicked shut behind her. I stood in the quiet, and I knew, tomorrow, they'd see what it looked like when silence turned to strategy. 10 days after Verena walked out of my apartment like she still owned the air I breathed, the court date arrived. It was a hearing ordered under the guise of concern, an independent mental health evaluation to determine my legal fitness and emotional equilibrium. Their words, not mine. The courthouse annex was nothing like the marble-lined courtroom most people picture when they think of justice. No dramatic chandeliers, no polished wood benches, just beige walls, buzzing lights, and a waiting room that smelled like cold air and recycled doubt. I arrived 10 minutes early. I wanted to be the one waiting, not the one watched. The woman at the reception desk took my name and gestured toward a side room. "They're ready for you." Inside sat a middle-aged psychologist in a gray suit that didn't quite fit. His tie was too tight, and he smiled with his teeth, but not his eyes. His nameplate read, "Dr. Charles Redmond." The court had appointed him. Neutral, they said. I greeted him politely, sat down, crossed my legs. I'd brought nothing with me, not even a bag. I wanted to show them that the only thing I carried was what I remembered, and I remembered everything. He opened a folder and looked at me like I was a case number, not a woman who'd built her career brick by brick. "Miss Everin, thank you for being here. I want to begin by acknowledging that this process is not accusatory." I didn't respond. I waited. He cleared his throat. "Do you feel your family has been targeting you unfairly?" "I feel they've been consistent," I said calmly. "They've always found creative ways to pretend I don't exist." He smiled again, still with the teeth. "Do you believe they're trying to harm you?" "I believe they're trying to contain me." His pen scratched across the page. "Do you believe your identity has been misrepresented?" "You mean legally?" I asked. "Yes, documented and notarized." His smile twitched. "Do you see yourself as a victim?" I leaned forward slightly. "I see myself as the only one in the room not lying." That shut him up, at least for a moment. The session lasted 40 minutes. I answered every question with precision. No emotion, no outbursts. They'd expected fragility. I gave them professionalism wrapped in steel. When I stepped out into the hallway, Verena was already there. She wore a beige blazer, pearls, and that curated look of motherly concern that belonged more to campaign ads than real life. Behind her, 2 court clerks wheeled in a cart holding a chair, a plain metal one, like something from a school nurse's office. And beside it, a black case I recognized instantly. Clippers. Verena approached, hands clasped in front of her. "Salome," she said softly. "I've requested a symbolic gesture as part of the healing process." I said nothing. She turned to the judge who had joined us, an older man with reading glasses slipping down his nose. "This is not punitive," she explained. "It's about cleansing, a reset, a moment of surrender to community care." He nodded, disinterested but agreeable. "It's voluntary," Verena said, glancing at me. "Of course." The clippers hummed as one of the clerks plugged them in. The sound filled the hallway like a swarm of bees trapped in a jar. I walked to the chair and sat down. Not because I agreed, because I wanted them to see that even when stripped, I wouldn't beg. A young woman with latex gloves and a neutral expression stepped forward. She looked at me, as if silently asking for permission. I gave her one slow nod. The first lock fell with a soft whisper against the tile, then another. The hum of the clippers drowned out every sound in the room, except my breath, steady and low. I didn't flinch. When she finished, I met Verena's eyes across the room. "Is this what it takes for you to see me?" I asked. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. I stood, smoothing the lapels of my blazer as if nothing had changed. Except everything had. No one spoke. Not the clerks. Not the judge. Not Verena. I walked out past them, scalp bare, shoulders back. In the hallway outside, a junior clerk, maybe 21, trembling in her courthouse badge, watched me pass with wide, tearful eyes. Later, as I was gathering my things to leave, she caught up to me near the security gate. "I saw what they did," she said, voice cracking. "I didn't know what to do." I looked at her for a moment and placed a hand lightly on her arm. "Now you do." I stepped outside into the early afternoon light. It was warm. Not suffocating. The breeze hit my bare scalp in a way I hadn't expected. Not cold, just real. 3 minutes later, I walked into the next courtroom. I wasn't scheduled to be there that day, but the judge had called out unexpectedly, and the docket needed someone to step in. I walked to the bench, slowly, the robe draped over my forearm like armor. A young clerk, eyes wide with recognition, stepped toward me and said, "Ma'am, I believe you're next up to preside." I nodded. Then I stepped up and sat in the chair they never thought I'd reach, with a head they thought they'd erased. The robe felt heavier that day. I unfolded it slowly, standing just behind the privacy panel near the side entrance to courtroom 3B. I could hear the murmur of voices, attorneys trading small talk, bailiffs giving low instructions, the occasional nervous laugh. But beneath it all, a hum was rising, a kind of static in the air, anticipation, or dread, depending on which row you were seated in. And when I stepped through the door, every head turned. Every conversation died mid-word. I didn't rush. I walked the length of the courtroom with even steps, the same rhythm I used years ago during my first opening statement. My scalp, bare, exposed, caught the courtroom lighting in a way I hadn't prepared for. Not harsh, just unmistakable. In the gallery, seated 3 rows from the front, were Verena, Cassian, and Isolde. I didn't look directly at them, but I felt the chill spread as recognition dawned. I could picture Verena's jaw tightening, Cassian shifting in his seat, Isolde pretending to text someone just so she wouldn't have to meet anyone's eyes. I climbed the 3 steps to the bench and turned to face the room. "All rise," the court clerk announced, her voice barely louder than a whisper. I slipped the robe over my shoulders, fastened the button, lifted the gavel. "This court is now in session for the matter of Arkell Holdings versus the Public Trust Review Committee." Gasps weren't allowed in courtrooms, but they came anyway, low and fast. Cassian's mouth parted. Isolde's hand dropped her phone into her lap. Verena didn't move at all. I could have looked at them. I didn't. "Clerk, please enter into evidence the following exhibits," I said, sliding a packet across the desk. Exhibit A, notarized proof of unauthorized digital signature use. Exhibit B, redacted HIPAA release and audit trail. Exhibit C, company registry screenshot showing manipulation of executive listing without consent. I didn't need to say names. I didn't need to call them out. The evidence spoke fluently. The attorneys at the prosecution table, hired by the Public Trust Review Committee to investigate unethical financial practices, sat straighter. One whispered something, eyes flicking between me and the family seated behind them. I continued, letting the clerk read the summary of each exhibit into the record. It took 10 minutes, not a word from the gallery. Until it came. Verena rose slowly, her heels sharp against the tile, her voice silked with the same poison she used at church socials and donor dinners. "You are making a mockery of this court by sitting where your bias bleeds." I didn't blink. "Bias doesn't erase evidence," I said. "It only blinds those unwilling to see it." The room inhaled. Reporters, seated along the back row, began scribbling furiously. Cassian started to stand, his lips parted to interrupt. I raised the gavel, not angrily but with clarity, and struck once. "You are not in control of this room anymore." He sat. I didn't smile. "This court formally recommends the State Judicial Committee initiate an ethics review of Arkell Holdings, specifically regarding conflict of interest violations and potential misuse of family-based trust structures for personal gain." I paused, let it settle. "Furthermore, I am submitting a notice to the Office of Civil Compliance regarding HIPAA violations stemming from unauthorized mental health record access to be investigated under federal review." Isolde looked like she wanted to vanish. Verena's mouth thinned into something brittle. Cassian stared at the floor. The final item on the docket passed without incident. A civil claim unrelated to Arkell Holdings. I ruled, I adjourned, then I stood. No one moved, no one dared. Mavis was waiting near the exit when I stepped down from the bench. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with something between pride and awe. "That," she finally whispered, "was the sound of a dynasty cracking." I exhaled slowly. "It's not cracked yet." She raised an eyebrow. "No," she said, "but it's finally shaking." Back in my chambers, the room was quiet. Too quiet after the roar of the courtroom. The blinds were half drawn. The sun had dipped just far enough to throw long shadows across the carpet. And there it was. A single envelope on my desk. Hand-addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in over 20 years. Looping, elegant, final. No return address, no seal, just my name. Inside was one piece of paper. "If you're reading this, you've already won." I sat in the chair, this time not the judge's bench, but my own. And I read it again. But what they never knew was that I didn't want to win. I just didn't want to disappear. The Savannah air felt heavy that evening, thick with the kind of southern humidity that turns suits into sweat rags and silences into thunder. I pulled into the historical hall parking lot just after the sun had ducked behind the horizon, leaving the sky flushed in hues of coral and steel blue. The gala had already begun. From the outside, the building looked exactly the way they wanted justice to feel. White columns, warm lights, banners with serif fonts praising voices of reform and legacy of integrity. I stared at those words for a moment too long, then stepped out of the car, my flats scuffing the pavement in slow, deliberate rhythm. Inside, the lights were low, the clinking of glass faint under layers of music from a string quartet in the corner. People mingled, posed for photos, exchanged compliments so practiced they almost sounded human. I didn't approach the stage. I didn't scan for familiar faces. I walked down the middle aisle with a quiet purpose, straight to the front row, where a single seat stood empty. Its card read, "Reserved for the one they tried to erase." There was a murmur behind me as I lowered myself into the chair. Not loud, just enough to confirm that the message had landed. I didn't smile. I didn't adjust my jacket. I folded my hands in my lap and looked straight ahead. They had built the whole night to celebrate voices. They didn't expect mine to echo just by sitting still. The ceremony moved forward without a hitch. Awards given, names praised, historical figures honored. I barely heard any of it. I wasn't there for applause. When it ended, and the crowd thinned out into polite conversations and Instagram captions, I slipped out the side door into a quieter hallway, away from the noise. She was already there. Odessa stood under the soft hallway lighting like she'd been waiting hours. She didn't say anything at first, just studied my face like it had changed since the last time we spoke. Maybe it had. "You look like your grandmother did," she said. "The day she buried her father. Same eyes, same defiance." "I've been called worse," I replied. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with time. "She wanted you to have this. Told me not to send it unless you came looking for your own name." I took it without a word. The paper was brittle in my hands, like the wind could take it, but it didn't. I opened it that night at home, after I hung up my coat and poured a glass of water, barefoot on the cool tile of my kitchen. The letter was in my grandmother's handwriting, round, sharp loops, no wasted space. "Salome, if they take everything, remember, I left this behind for you. The truth has roots they can't pull. and neither can you. She had signed it simply, GP. It was enough. It was everything. The next morning, the news broke. One of the reporters had connected the dots. Judge Everin, who had presided over Arkell Holdings' investigation, was also their blood. The media was already spinning it. Bias, impropriety, ethics questions. But the filings were airtight. My disclosures had been timely. My recusal had been reviewed and rejected. There was no scandal, just clarity. Still, Verena issued a statement. Though we maintain concern for the integrity of all legal institutions, we respect the outcome and are moving forward privately. Translation. She didn't win, but she'd pretend it was her choice. Meanwhile, social media had its own opinions. #erased no more started trending within hours. Messages poured in, some angry, some grateful, some just stunned. I didn't respond to any of them. I wasn't trying to become a symbol. I just didn't want to be a secret. Later that week, I drove out to the Arkell estate. The magnolias were blooming again, just like they did the year my grandfather taught me how to press soil without suffocating roots. I parked at the end of the gravel path and walked in through the side door, still unlocked, like time had frozen in that one corner of tradition. No one was home. The housekeeper had left for the day, probably told not to be there when I arrived. The hallway hadn't changed. Same photos, same frames. Cassian's graduation, Isolde's wedding, a watercolor of the estate drawn by some artist friend of my mother's, every image curated. Mine, of course, was missing. I stood in front of the wall for a long minute. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, creased photo. It was me, age 7, kneeling next to a just-planted sapling, dirt on my face, my grandfather's hand resting on my back. I lifted one of the frames, popped the backing open, and slipped the photo inside, tucked just behind the image of Isolde holding a plaque at some fundraiser. They wouldn't see it unless they looked. But it would be there. "You don't need to see me," I whispered to the air. "I just need to exist." As I turned to leave, the screen door creaked. A reporter had followed me. "Judge Everin," he called gently, notebook in hand, voice careful. "Do you feel vindicated?" I paused on the porch, the breeze brushing against my scalp, still unfamiliar and yet oddly free. "I feel seen," I said. Then I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away from a house that once tried to teach me I had to earn space to breathe. The news moved slower 2 weeks later, but it still moved. Every morning, a new headline appeared, each one quieter than the last, but all with the same undercurrent. Accountability comes dressed in different clothes. Cassian was under formal investigation for identity fraud and trust misappropriation. They hadn't cuffed him, not yet, but the paperwork alone was enough to drag him through the legal equivalent of quicksand. Isolde had stepped back from her PR firm to focus on family, though everyone knew her board had asked her to go silent before their clients did. And Verena, not a word, no interviews, no retractions, just a quiet donation made in her name to the Georgia Center for Mental Health Advocacy, unannounced, but leaked just enough to look like virtue. Classic. She still hadn't picked up the phone. I hadn't expected her to. That Friday morning, I returned to the Arkell estate for what would be, I knew, the last time. The excuse was simple. I was retrieving a law textbook I had loaned to Cassian years ago. A signed copy, now more sentimental than useful, but still mine. The housekeeper let me in without comment. The hallway smelled like pine cleaner and furniture polish. Everything was pristine, unchanged, as if preserving the illusion of permanence would keep the truth from rotting through. I moved through the corridor slowly, knowing exactly where I wanted to end up. The gallery wall. The one with the gold-trimmed frames. Cassian's university honors. Isolde's debutante portrait. My parents' wedding day. Even an oil painting of my grandfather's hunting dogs. But not one image of me. Not even the kindergarten photo where I was missing a front tooth and holding a ribbon I'd won for a spelling bee. Not the picture of me graduating law school with a scholarship pin on my collar. Not even a group shot from my 10th birthday, where I'd sat between Isolde and Grandpa and laughed hard enough to cry. Gone. Deliberate. I stared for a long while, textbook forgotten under my arm. The ache didn't surprise me anymore. It had become a familiar companion. But that morning, it didn't hollow me out. It settled, low and steady, like a stone planted in wet earth. I opened my purse and pulled out the photo I'd been carrying for weeks. A 5x7, faded around the edges. Me, age 7, kneeling in the dirt, palms filthy, next to the tiny magnolia we'd planted. Grandpa's hand rested gently on my shoulder, steady as the roots we'd buried. I flipped one of the frames open, the one with Cassian at a ribbon cutting, and tucked the photo behind it. Hidden, but there. "You don't have to love me," I whispered to the empty hallway. "But you don't get to rewrite me." I left the book on the hallway table and walked out without a backward glance. That afternoon, I finalized the paperwork for the nonprofit. We called it Visible Justice, a legal advocacy group built for people like me, those who had been silenced in rooms where they were supposed to be safe. Our first cases were already queued: a daughter cut from her parents' estate for leaving the church, a retired school teacher whose niece had slowly drained her accounts, a young mother fighting a custody battle where emotional instability was used like a sword. I wasn't trying to change the whole world, just the parts they thought no one was watching. 2 weeks later, at a small community brunch hosted by a local civic group, I sat with a paper plate of biscuits and fruit when an older woman approached my table. She was maybe 70, with storm gray hair and the kind of voice that once taught classrooms to hush. She reached out and gently gripped my hand. "I stayed silent my whole life," she said. "You made my silence feel like it wasn't a waste." I didn't know what to say, so I held her hand a little longer. A few minutes later, a teenage girl passed our table. She hesitated, then stopped. Her eyes flicked to my buzzed hair, then down to her hoodie. She reached up, pulled it back, and revealed her own shaved head underneath. She didn't smile, just nodded, and kept walking. Somewhere between the chicken salad and the closing remarks, I found myself sitting on a bench under one of the magnolia trees at the edge of the event lawn. The breeze was soft, brushing through the branches like a lullaby. A nearby radio played a clipped recap of my case. Judge Salome Everin, who gained national attention for presiding over a case involving her own family, now leads a nonprofit focused on legal reform and advocacy. I closed my eyes, thought of my grandmother's letter, thought of how far I'd come just to take up space in my own life. This wasn't about winning, it was about being unerasable. Because legacy isn't what they write about you, it's what they can never erase. Sometimes, justice isn't about punishment. It's about being seen, being heard, and reclaiming the parts of yourself others tried to erase. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or like your voice didn't matter, maybe this story reminded you, silence can be powerful until it's time to speak. What would you do if the people who raised you became the ones who tried to silence you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this family story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. More real, powerful stories are coming your way.